Chris, thank you so much for joining me.
A pleasure. Thank you.
So lots of stuff to talk about. I suppose the big question at the moment is, what in your opinion is the reason that we've all become really focused on climate change at the moment?
It is interesting how it's happened so quickly, isn't it? I've been working in this area for about 15 years as I moved away from a conventional business career. And it appeared to be going nowhere for a very long time. There was a burst of interest in 2008, 2010, but since then, it's really been an uphill struggle until last year. Now, what is it? It's a confluence of factors, isn't it? It's never a single cause that moves a society in the direction that it decides eventually to go. It's a sense, I believe, firstly, that it is possible to make a transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy. In other words, we're not wasting our time by trying to make movement on climate change. It's the existence of effective protest movements for the first time, whether it be a Swedish teenager or whether it be Extinction Rebellion. It's absolutely extraordinary how in the last year, Greta Thunberg has moved from being a single teenager outside the Stockholm Parliament to being possibly one of the best known faces in the world. Now, whether that'll produce action or not is another matter, but she has cohered a movement around her, particularly actually in North America, which is capable of providing the political impetus to take action. A very indirect and roundabout answer, because I actually not completely sure why this has happened yet.
You must be glad, though.
Well, I think people like me were drifting into pessimism, actually, a feeling that this was all a waste of time and we should just go out and cultivate our gardens, as opposed to trying to be activists. It now looks as though there might be some point in activism. It's still very difficult, in my view, to work out whether one should try to work with the forces, the existing powerful forces in the world, governments, large companies or whatever, or whether one needs to act as an insurgent fighting against that. My view, for what it's worth, and this is a debate inside the ecological movement all the time, of course, is that cooperation with the powerful forces is the necessary way forward. It may not be always entirely comfortable, but we do need to work with the rest of society and things like the availability of capital. We're going to require trillions of dollars of investment capital to make the transition work, and that can only come from the companies that control it, from the governments that incentivize the use of that capital.
And tell me, Chris, do we have the technological ability, do we have the technology to get to zero carbon?
We have the technology, absolutely no question about it. It's not in some cases as cheap as existing technologies. For example, if we look at steel, we need to move away from using coal to operate blast furnaces. 3-4% of world emissions. There's an answer, clearly. It's using hydrogen instead. That would be approximately twice as expensive as coal at the moment, perhaps more than that even. And wouldn't make a significant difference to the eventual price of a car, for example, perhaps 1% in fact. But nevertheless, it's not as cheap yet. But across increasing numbers of sectors, for example, electricity generation, it's the most obvious example, electricity generation almost everywhere around the world is now more cheaply done using renewables than it would be using fossil fuels.
That's really good news. That's really good news. So you mentioned coal and you mentioned hydrogen. What are the industries that you think are most under threat as we transition?
Well, we've already seen a few industries collapse as a result of changes to the structure of demand. The coal industry, for example, is one. We saw another major bankruptcy or move into financial administration a few days ago with one of the largest American coal producers. We have seen, for example, the near destruction of the gas turbine industry, an industry which supplies capital equipment to an industry, to a sector that is moving rapidly away from using fossil fuels, i.e. electricity. So any sector where you're selling capital equipment to increase the capacity of an industry that is changing rapidly we'll see very rapid changes in demand.
Wow.
So, for example, people providing components for fossil fuel cars, people making power generation equipment of all types. The list is a very long one. It's not specific. It's not specific to any one sector, but we will see massive changes in the structure of industry and a lot of value destruction, which I think is not yet even beginning to be priced into share prices.
And it's interesting you touched on that because, and you also mentioned it earlier. You mentioned about investors. What are the implications for investors with more rapid switching to? Big question. Sorry.
It is, and it's one which is right at the centre of this debate. And those of us who want a rapid transition want to convince the investment community that they should be part of this. They should be activists themselves for selfish reasons. This is not altruism. This is saying to the investment community, look, you are going to see some very rapid periods of huge reduction in value across some of your portfolio. Now, working out where those reductions in value are going to come is a complicated task, and I think it's interesting. It's more and more the kind of question which I get approached to think about. It's not always very easy to do. It's always impossible to put a timescale on it, but you can begin to say where these reductions in value are actually going to happen.
Okay, and you mentioned hydrogen as well earlier, and it's something that you talk about quite a lot. Why is hydrogen so important?
Right, yes, I apologise for banging on about this. It is interesting. In the rest of Europe, there is a growing realisation, I think it's fair to say, that the transition to a zero carbon economy will be powered by renewable electricity, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, and a few other things at the margins, combined with hydrogen. Now, what is hydrogen? Hydrogen is a store of energy, and it effectively acts as a replacement for the stores of energy which we use so productively at the moment: coal, gas, and oil. So when we've got too much renewable electricity, which increasingly, even in the UK, we're finding is difficult to deal with, we take that electricity and we do what we did, well, I'm going to use the expression, in the fifth form at my school. I don't know what, I can't even think what that is.
Me neither, but I recognise fifth form.
year 12 now. You put a bit of electric current across some water and you see oxygen appearing at one electrode and hydrogen at the other. It's a very simple process. Of course, a lot more needs to be done to make this into something of a commercial size. But around the world, we're beginning to see renewable energy, electricity, used extensively to make hydrogen. That hydrogen is then stored either for use to generate electricity from burning or from fuel cells later, or conversion into other things, or I suspect as a direct replacement for natural gas in some places. So the enormous amount of effort going into this in countries like the Netherlands and in Germany. We here in the UK have barely begun. There are some very, very interesting case histories, particularly on the islands of Orkney off the north coast of Scotland, where there's experiments, significant large-scale experiments with hydrogen. But the UK does need to wake up to the importance of finding an alternative use for renewable energy as we move into longer and longer periods of excess electricity, particularly coming from offshore wind farms in the North Sea.
That's fascinating because, to be aware that there's excess, I mean, that's I would have thought it was a good thing. But coming back to the hydrogen...
Well, it's not a good thing for those people who own those assets because, for example, in Orkney, something like 50% of the electricity generated, they tell me, isn't able to be used. And that's an awful waste. They want to be able to sell that electricity for obvious reasons and use it for and use that money for community purposes. So there's a strong incentive if you put all that money into building an offshore wind farm to make sure that the electricity that you generate is actually used.
Absolutely, absolutely. So tell me, I'm going to come back to hydrogen again. So what about hydrogen cars?
Well, my view, and this is not necessarily the conventional view, is that that's a complete waste of time. Hydrogen cars, we're moving up in a direction which has already been captured by electric vehicles. Can't see myself hydrogen cars being ever as cheap as battery cars. The amount of cash now going into the creation of battery cars, particularly from the large German manufacturers, Volkswagen, for example, now means that we're going to have electric cars that are as cheap as fossil fuel cars, probably within, I don't know, 2 to 4 years, just on a forecourt price basis, let alone the cost of operating these cars. For hydrogen fuel cell cars, which are still very expensive, the Toyota Mirai typically around £60,000 or equivalent around the world, there is very small market for that. Second point is we're getting better and better at charging cars. So we will find large numbers of fast chargers able to charge cars in 10-15 minutes from empty to full, developing around the country, UK and elsewhere around Europe very soon. That's going to mean that there's really very little reason why one should switch to a hydrogen fuel cell car.
I can't wait personally for us to have a really great infrastructure and we can go all electric. I think it's brilliant. So tell me, you mentioned Orkney. Which countries should we be looking at and which areas should we be looking at to see what's happening in terms of energy transition?
Well, I think the two countries to follow most closely, and one of them is, I think, a slight surprise to people, and I'll mention that first, is Australia. So Australia has a political system which is still not entirely comfortable with the idea that global warming exists, because so much of the economy is reliant upon the exports of high carbon goods and services, such as, for example, coal, steel, etc. Now, but what's happening in Australia is already the things that I've been talking about, the excess. We can see a route to very large quantities of electricity being available very cheaply. Cheap solar, and in some places around Australia, very cheap wind as well, onshore wind. That means that they can see at the beginnings of the development of an industry which is entirely renewable based. So there are big projects, for example, to export hydrogen from Australia to Japan and Korea. There's one illustration. And there's a sense that the electricity system there is more vulnerable, it's more stressed than it is in most of Europe. And as a result, the reasons for change are greater than they would be here. And then the second is Germany, possibly combined with the Netherlands, where there's a realization there that they're falling behind. Frankly, after 10 years of really working hard to build renewable electricity, they're still using a great deal of coal in their electricity generation. And there's an awareness that that has to change. There's also a closer combination between universities and the government and companies there, with a view to building industrial sectors that will take Germany away from its areas of current competence, but into a prosperous future based around zero carbon economic activities.
That's fascinating. That's really interesting. Thank you. So I want more information from you. I now want to know which companies we should be watching.
Oh gosh, no, this is difficult, right? Oh,
I do like putting you on the spot, Chris.
Yes. Well, I mean, these are not stock recommendations, I should say.
Okay.
Right. This is just the companies that I have on my list to read the press releases on, if I may be blunt about this. Okay, so let's run down the list. A few of them, and I'll miss some of them out, but these are just some illustrations. First of all, companies that are working on developing low-cost conversion of electricity into hydrogen. And the obvious examples there are the electrolyzer manufacturers. Electrolyzer is the bit of kit which turns electricity into hydrogen and oxygen. And you should be following ITM Power, a British company, Hydrogenics, a Canadian company which has just taken a big investment, a French company called McPhee, and a Norwegian company called Nel. There you've got a reasonable cross-section of the electrolyzer companies in the world. What are they doing? Are they growing rapidly? I mean, is the average size of their installations increasing to where it's genuinely industrial scale? We're seeing signs they're not quite there yet. So that's one sector I would be watching very, very carefully. Then you need to look at the new technologies that will begin to take over from existing forms of solar power generation. We in this country, we don't have very high levels of solar radiance. It's not bad in the summer because temperatures are low and that helps the productivity of solar panels, but it's pretty awful today. at the end of October. But most parts of the world, solar is going to be the cheapest form of electricity generation. So I follow a couple of companies that really look as though they're going to be the forefront of the next generation of solar panels. A British company called Oxford PV, based just north of me, 2 miles north of me, where I'm sitting in Oxford, with a new technology based around a set of chemicals called perovskites. And then a company in Germany called Heliotech, which is now partly owned by the French conglomerate Engie, which is developing another sort of very thin, very flexible, very cheap solar panel based upon what are called organic molecules. So that's another sector there. I'm interested in companies that collect carbon dioxide from the air. That is to say, companies that will be called upon when we fail to get a full grip of the climate change problem, to actually extract carbon from the air. And the companies to follow there are a Swiss company called Climeworks, absolutely fascinating company with, I think, an unbelievable future in front of it if things go the way they seem to be going, and a Canadian company called Carbon Engineering. So there's 3 sectors, and I think I'd be very happy to talk more about those. I think probably I need to write a blog post about the things where I think where people interested in the transition need to be following the new technologies.
It's interesting you didn't mention Tesla, that is very prominent, of course.
Well, you don't need to follow Tesla. Tesla, as it were, crops
everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, so why didn't I mention Tesla? Because its performance is well understood. Also, it's not at the forefront. I wish to be negative about this, because clearly without Tesla, we wouldn't be having the electric vehicle revolution that we're having. So perhaps I should have included it, but it's not going to change the world. Perhaps it's already changed the world. I'm not sure it's going to change the world that much more, because it is being followed so effectively by the large car companies. After a decade of resistance, they now realize they have no choice. In many ways, I think it would be, if you're interested in the sector, it's more interesting to follow Volkswagen than it is to follow Tesla, because it's them, in my opinion, they make 10 million cars a year compared to Tesla's less than 10% of that. And it's them that are putting the huge amounts of capital into this now. So they would be the people that I followed, as opposed to Tesla, to try and work out the way the whole industry is going to go.
Great, interesting. Thank you for that. So one area that we haven't talked about is food production, which must have a huge impact on emissions.
Yeah.
What do you predict will happen with regards to agriculture?
I think this is an absolutely fascinating topic. I have a book coming out in January, which is a large chapter on something like 25% of global emissions, a mixture of both of carbon dioxide, but mostly methane and nitrous oxide, come from the food production chain. And it's not what we think it is. It's not food miles that are creating this problem. It's the fact that it's primarily the fact that cultivation of animals, results in methane emissions from the animals themselves, particularly, of course, sheep and cows, but also the application of fertilizer to create the food that the animals eat results in a lot of emissions from the land as well, mostly in the form of nitrous oxide. So what are we going to do about this? Well, my view, for what it's worth, and this is not a comfortable thing to say, is it's very difficult to reconcile a zero carbon future, which we all say we want, with more than a tiny amount of meat available on the planet. This is not a nice conclusion, given how culturally vital meat eating is, how important the farming sector is to many economies. But it does seem to me that the deleterious impacts, the bad impacts of particularly beef production, do mean that we are going to have to make radical changes in diet.
Wow.
And that needs to be combined with a lot of other changes to agriculture as well, including moving as much as we can off fields and into factories. That this is one of the great trends at the moment. It's only a tiny fraction of all vegetable production is now in factory farms, which is what they are. But vertical farming is beginning to take off around the world. And that's another sector which I should have probably have mentioned, that if you're interested in the future of agriculture, you will need to cover what is happening to indoor farming, where leafy greens, strawberries, cucumbers, tomatoes, etc., are being created by completely new technologies which don't use up valuable land.
Excellent. Okay, so some changes ahead for all of us, I think. But let me ask you this question. Are you broadly optimistic?
I think the technology is fully there, and we understand what we need to do. Does human society have the capacity to make the changes? Not certain. Sorry, I wish I could say I was optimistic, but I don't. The speed of change has got to increase several degrees of several multiples.
Okay, I think my last question. I think some of the answers are obvious from what you've said, but let's just really say it once more. Finally, what can we as individuals do? What can we change?
Oh, well, it's a list of very uncomfortable things for most of us, whether it be changing the diet towards essentially a vegan diet. 1-2% of people are there, probably 10% of people are moving in that direction, but most of us still eat meat. We need to radically change our consumption patterns more widely. Clothing is probably, I can't remember the exact figure, something like 10% of world emissions in one way or another. Most of what we buy is thrown away long before we have worn it out. Big cultural changes there, shifting from buying things afresh to having things remade, buying things secondhand, renting things. None of this is going to be comfortable, none of it's easy. The generation, my daughters in their mid-20s are very prepared to make these switches. I don't think my generation is at all yet. So once again, we may find that people in the 60s are holding back the necessary changes. But absolutely, we are not going to be able to continue to exploit the planet in the way we have been doing. And this is not these are not the words of a hippie eco-activist, as you can see. These are, you just have to look at this problem and say, is it going to be possible to change the world fast enough without significant changes in personal lifestyle? No, it is not. No, virtually no flying, no meat eating, keep your clothes for longer, etc., etc. The list is a long one. And a lot of these things are non-trivial. Merely not using plastic bags is not going to take us through to the right answer.
Okay, Chris, I think we've got an action plan there. I think we challenge everybody to make some changes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.